All right, welcome back. It's episode 16 of Afrolantican Jurisprudence. We're doing like a five-part, I guess you could call it mini-series on a review of Herodotus's histories, right? The Greek historian Herodotus, sometimes called the father of history, wrote a book called The Histories, and we're reviewing it from an Afrocentric legal perspective and basically reframing it as what happened to the Afrocentric Eurasian Empire. Because what we're maintaining is that from the 18th dynasty and from periods even before that, but from the 18th Egyptian dynasty, basically the Nile Valley civilizations from Kemet and including Kush with the 25th dynasty, not only had an African empire, but through taxation. And again, I'm a tax law professor, so that's one of the things that are most interesting to me. And I think taxation really makes things real to people. When you have taxation, you know you have jurisdiction, you have domination, you have subordination, you have the power of the state. And so the argument is, this is backed up by Martin Brunel, this is backed up by Keith Seal, that Kemet, Kush, and whatnot, Ethiopia had that the Eurasia or Turkey, Syria, Greece, Palestine, Israel, all the way to the Euphrates River, Iraq and Iran, Arabia, were basically subject to this Nile Valley Empire. They were subject to taxation from this Nile Valley Empire until the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and whatnot took over. So we're basically making the argument that, again, this Afrocentric empire, Herodotus' histories describes, yes, the beginning of Greece, the emergence of Greece, but in doing so, he's also describing the decline of the Nile Valley empires, the black civilizations of Kemet. And again, Herodotus is known as the father of history, but because he very specifically denotes the Egyptians or the Cometians as black, he is later called the father of lies. But you'll see from the readings here how detailed he is. And we're never going to say that any historian has the complete truth. None of us have a hold on it. So we're not reciting Herodotus to say that this is the gospel, this is precisely what happened. However, he did not, even if he were to pull everything out of air, which we know he didn't, but even if he were to pull it out of air, where would it have come from? Why would the Africans in his stories be described as pious? Why would the Europeans, especially farther northern they go, be described as more like savages and what have you? So we can either look at it for the exact truth or for analogies and whatnot and the mythology, and it still leads us more or less into the same place. Okay, so this is episode 16. This is going to be basically the first chapter in the upcoming book describing this. Will be a very short book because we're really just relying on bringing out Herodotus and quotes Herodotus has in his book about Africa and trying to put them in proper context. We already did an introduction on episode 15. This episode 16, again, we're calling this Herodotus versus Strabo, right? We're going to talk about why Herodotus is considered the father of lies by some because he speaks so well of Africans. After this episode, we'll do episode 17, which is Akhmos versus Polycrates, and talking about specifically the ways in which Egypt taxed Phoenicia, Greece, and whatnot, brought them within the empire and a system called African feudal taxation. African feudal taxation. That inspires a lot of this work because African feudal taxation as an anthropological dynamic or phenomenon hadn't really been discussed until the 1970s, 80s, 90s. And so that hasn't been applied to the study of antiquity. But if we take the principles of African feudal taxation and reread our historical sources, haha, bang, we see how vast the empires of Africa were. Episode 18, after that, we're going to talk about, again, the formation of Greece, its alliance with a nation called Lydia and a king called Croesus, and how they basically threw off the shackles of Athens, which was basically an Egyptian colony. After that, we'll talk about in episode 19, we'll talk about the actual Persian conquest of Egypt, and we're going to describe a pharaoh named Psammetichus, describing him as more or less the last African king of Kemet before the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and all that took over. But then we're also going to, in episode 20, we're going to talk about Ethiopian, Carthaginian, and Phoenician resistance. The Ethiopians routed the Persians. The Persians tried to get down up the Nile Valley to Napata, Meroe, and were soundly defeated. And they also describe meetings between the ambassadors in Persia and Ethiopia, and the discussion is absolutely astounding. That is, for me, the best episode of this whole series. I can't wait till episode 20. We finish it off. Well, we go from there to the persistence of African matriarchy, how Cambyses, the Persian king, and now Pharaoh of Egypt, was still pressured by Egyptian culture, by African culture, to have a queen mother. That the golden calf, Hathor, was the symbol of resistance to Persian domination. And in response, Cambyses actually had to marry his sister to provide them with something of a queen or queen mother, because authority, the ability to tax, right? The authority, the legitimacy of tax has to flow through a queen mother. In Afrocentric cultures. So that is also sort of proof of how domineering and how hegemonic Egyptian and African culture was at the time. We'll do an episode 22 that'll be a little shorter. We'll take Molefe Asante's latest book on Africa and see what he says more specifically, what the latest research tells us about the decline of the Nile Valley Empire. Starting with after the 25th dynasty. Now, having said that, we do know that as Egypt declined, Kush was on the rise, Axum was on the rise, and in West Africa, we know the Nok civilization and Ghana were all on the rise contemporaneous with Egypt's fall. So when we say the decline of this Afrocentric empire, what we're basically saying is the end of the period in which Africans are dominating regions outside of Africa, all the way up to Turkey, all the way up to the Aegean Principle in Greece and whatnot. Again, yes, we'll talk about the Moors and whatnot later, but again, as far as a taxation system where the head central government is in Africa, and yet jurisdictions and countries outside of the continent are paying taxes to that authority, that's what we're dealing with here when we talk about what happened to the Afrocentric Eurasian empire. All right. So what we're going to do forward now is go through a bunch of quotes. We're actually going to hear from Herodotus himself, well, or at least the English translation of Herodotus himself, right? And of course, that's always fraught with difficulty, because whoever translated his work from Greek to English, of course, had their biases, right? And if certain words didn't seem appropriate to them or gave certain people too much credit, they would use different words. We'll see examples of that in further episodes. But for right now, let's look at the ethnology of Herodotus, right? Before he talks about the emergence of Greece, he wants to actually set up the world he lives in. So he's talking about the culture of the Greeks, the culture of the Egyptians, the culture of what's called the Scythians, and the culture of the Persians. And we see from this description, this ethnology, that Egypt is so much unlike Persia, so much unlike Scythia. And even this distinction between Sparta and Athens, Sparta is more like the Persians and the Scythians. They are more like the patriarchal European construct or culture, where Athens is, again, a former Egyptian colony and follows a very Afrocentric culture. And it's very much borne out um, through Herodotus speaking on these different cultures. So, without further ado, let's get to his precise words. And unfortunately, some of these quotes will be very long, but again, I think the precision is necessary so that we can be confident when we recite Herodotus in describing the greatness of the African empire. So first, let's say, let's quote him here. Concerning Egypt itself, I shall extend my remarks to a great length, because there is no country that possesses so many wonders, nor any that has such a number of works which defy description. Not only is the climate different than that of the rest of the world, and the rivers unlike any other rivers, because remember the Nile River is going to flow from south to north, but the people also, in most of their manners and customs, exactly reverse the common practice of mankind. And of course, mankind, in his view, is Greek, right? Is European. Um, so, in describing this distinction between Egypt and Greece, and again, the more distinct it is, the more we can be confident that Egypt's customs did not come from Greece, right? It did not come from Scythia. It did not come from Persia. So, so these distinctions in culture prove, or at least suggest very strongly, that Egypt was an African country, an African nation that did not get its culture from other places, but that developed this culture endogenously and then spread it out to the rest of the world. Listen to what Herodotus says about the position of women and men. And again, this will come back later because we want to make the point that Herodotus is not some Negrophile. He's not this lover of black people and is just praising black people because he wants to be one or something like that. He's still trying to praise Greek. He's a Greek, right? And so he actually paints the men of Egypt as fairly effeminate in their culture, but in our modern society, it all serves very well to the Egyptians to show that their views on gender were extremely advanced. Here he goes. The women attend the markets and trade, while the men sit at home at the loom. And the loom is to weave clothes. And here, while the rest of the world works to woof up the warp, the Egyptians work it down. The women likewise carry burdens upon their shoulders, while the men carry them upon their heads. Their men wear 2 garments apiece, their women but one. Sons need not support their parents unless they choose, but daughters must whether they choose or not. Herodotus goes in a lot of different things about the distinction of the Egyptian women versus other women. Now, he doesn't say that everything is equal. On the one hand, he says the Egyptian women cannot be priests. Yet, in the same breath, he also describes in a lot of detail the oracles. You've heard of the Oracle of Delphi. You've seen the oracle in the Matrix movies, right? This woman who is to predict or represent the gods and have predictions and whatnot. We also see in the Egyptian Herodotus histories that the oracles actually had some jurisprudential responsibilities. So they weren't just soothsayers and diviners, right? But saying that means that they had some religious role seemingly akin to the priesthood, or at least with its own power bank. And I think that is really the case. When we go through ancient Egyptian history or ancient African history, we're going to have to recharacterize a lot of different dynamics and reset our mind from the European construct. For example, again, women in the priesthood or women in what's called royal harems. These were colleges where the arts were practiced. These people had power. It wasn't just a sex stockade for the king. It might have been that way in Europe, but in Africa we didn't play it like that. So on the one hand, he says that Egyptian women could not be priests. However, let's talk about the oracles. The following tale, this is Herodotus' words, the following tale is commonly told in Egypt concerning the oracle of Dodona in Greece and that of Ammon in Libya. My informants on the point, and it's important that the oracle of Ammon is in Libya. My informants on the point were the priests of the Jupiter at Thebes. They said, and Thebes being in Upper Egypt, right, the southern portion. They said that two of the sacred women were once carried off from Thebes by the Phoenicians, and that the story went that one of them was sold into Libya and the other into Greece. And these women were the first founders of the oracles in those two countries. Right? So they're setting up religious institutions in these countries that emanated from the southern part of Egypt. And we know that the southern part of Egypt derives its culture from Nubia and Ethiopia. This is what I heard from the priests of Thebes at Dodona. However, the women who deliver the oracles relate the matter as follows. Two black doves flew away from Egyptian Thebes. You heard that, right? Two black doves flew away from Egyptian Thebes, and while one directed its flight to Libya, the other came to them. She alighted on an oak, and sitting there began to speak with a human voice and directed its flight to Libya, and told them on the spot where she was that there should henceforth be an oracle of Jove. They understood the announcement to be from heaven, so they set to work at once and erected the shrine. My own opinion of these matters as follows. I think, and when I say my, we're talking about Herodotus at this point. I think it to be true that the Phoenicians carried off the holy women and sold them for slaves, the one into Libya and the other into Greece. This last must have been sold to the Thesprotians. Having acquired a knowledge of the Greek tongue, she set up an oracle. She also mentioned that her sister had been sold for a slave into Libya by the same persons as herself. So again, Herodotus is not suffering from negrophilia. He is not in love with black people. He's still between two stories, one where the oracles themselves go out and establish religious institutions in Libya and in Greece. He doesn't believe that. He'd rather believe the story that the Phoenicians captured them and then sold them as slaves into these places, where it. But that doesn't seem to jive with their being the founders of very important religious institutions and thereafter becoming basically judges and jurists. Listen to this. The Dodonians called the women doves because they were foreigners and seemed to them to make a noise like birds. By calling the dove black, the Dodonians indicated that the woman was an Egyptian, and certainly the character of the oracles at Thebes and Dodona is very similar. Okay? I want to get to jump ahead to the legal case that we were talking about. See, while Herodotus is trying to learn about his world, the question of how far Egypt extend got to him. Because again, remember, Herodotus is around 500 BC. So 500 BC, Egypt is the Pharaonic Egypt, the first dynasty, was at least 3,000 years prior. And we know that before them, Badarians, Cemetery El, that for thousands of years. So by the time Herodotus gets on the scene, right, Egypt is pretty much old and tired. The northern part of Egypt, the Delta, has now become richer and wealthier than the southern part, and that's the part of that's closest to the Mediterranean, where now you have all these peoples from different places, especially much lighter skinned people, and that becomes to the Greeks what Egypt is. The agricultural South becomes part of Africa in their minds. But Herodotus is smart enough to know that Egypt is the entire 600-mile furlong of the Nile, from the Egyptian delta, from the northern delta, all the way from the southern cities of Elephantine and Thebes. And so he even makes this point that he notes a legal case where Libyans try, or at least some Egyptian peoples tried to also break away from Egypt and become Libyans because they felt that that was better, but it was refused. Here, Herodotus recited the legal case examining the extent of Egypt's legal jurisdiction, and more astounding is the arbiter of this decision was none other than one of the oracles, and therefore presumably a black woman. Here he goes. If then my judgment on these matters be right, the Ionians are mistaken in what they say of Egypt. Here I take my leave of the opinions of them and proceed to deliver my own sentiments on these subjects. I consider Egypt to be the whole country inhabited by the Egyptians, just as Cilicia is a tract occupied by the Cilicians. My judgment as to the extent of Egypt is confirmed by an oracle delivered by the shrine of Amen, of which I had no knowledge at all until after I had formed my opinion. It happened that the people of the cities of Morea and Apis, who lived in the part of Egypt that borders on Libya, right, and Apis is a bull, the borders on Libya, took a dislike to the religious usages of the country concerning sacrificial animals, and wished no longer to be restricted from eating the flesh of cows. Remember, Egypt is a pastoral society. That cattle and cow is wealth. They represent the founding of the nation. That is why the goddess Hathor has the horns. And if you see Africans today, many of their totems and monikers, from Madagascar all the way to the western coast, will have cattle culture horns as sort of a national symbol or totem to represent this cattle culture. So they did not allow people to eat cows at that time in Egypt, and so to break away, to be allowed to do so, these people on the border said, no, we're not Egyptians, we're Libyans. But that case had to be resolved, and the oracles were the ones to resolve it. So as they believed themselves to be Libyans and not Egyptians, they sent to the shrine to say that having nothing in common with the Egyptians, neither inhabiting the delta nor using the Egyptian tongue, they claimed to be allowed to eat whatever they pleased. Their request, however, was refused by the god, or at least through the oracle's interpretation of the god, who declared in reply that Egypt was the entire tract of country which the Nile overspreads and irrigates, and the Egyptians were the people who lived below Elephantine and drank the waters of that river. So if you're down with the Nile, you were down with Egypt. But what really is astounding is Herodotus describing legal cases, describing the legal jurisdiction of Egypt, and having the arbiter or the judge of that decision being a woman, an oracle, and presuming a black woman. It's absolutely amazing. And again, this is why Herodotus' work is that controversial. All right, now going back to this idea of culture and the distinct culture of the Cometians or of Kemet versus Persia or Greece or Scythia, let's look even further here. They say all other men pass their lives separate from animals. The Egyptians have animals always living with them. Others make barley and wheat their food. It is a disgrace to do so in Egypt, right? So grains and cereals, Egyptians were wealthy enough to have their diets were based on meat, right? Where those around them, especially in Arabia and Persia, were based on grains. Herodotus goes on, they are the only people in the world, they at least, and such have learned the practice for them, who use circumcision. Cleanliness, circumcision, avoiding sexually transmitted diseases and whatnot, is a huge issue in Egypt, where it's not an issue in other places. Cleanliness is one of the major distinctions between Africans and Europeans and Asians at this time. Here they go. The Egyptians drink out of brazen cups, which they scour every day. There is no exception to this practice. They wash their dishes. It seems common to us, but back then this is bougie, right? They wear linen garments, which they are especially careful to have always fresh washed. They practice circumcision for the sake of cleanliness, considering it better to be cleanly than comely. The priests have shaved their whole body every other day, that no lice or other impure thing may adhere to them when they are engaged in the service of the gods. Their dress is entirely of linen, and their shoes of the papyrus plant. It is not lawful for them to wear either dress or shoes of any other material. They bathe twice every day in cold water, and twice each night, besides which they observe, so to speak, thousands of ceremonies. So there's an obsession with cleanliness. You get a feel for the Egyptian environment. I mean, with fresh linens and whatnot, the way the people acted and walked. Now, I've spoken a lot about taxation in Egypt, and we're not going to talk about the different tax systems. I've written about that a while ago. Maybe we'll revisit that at a later date. But this one, we're going to talk about where they're spending their money, on how they support the priesthood and how they support the population. And especially the distinction between the wealth here versus the lack of wealth we're going to describe with respect to Persia and Scythia. They enjoy, however, not a few advantages. They consume none of their own property and are at no expense for anything, but everyday bread is baked for them of the sacred corn, and a plentiful supply of beef and of goose's flesh is assigned to each, and also a portion of wine made from the grape. Fish they are not allowed to eat, and beans, which none of the Egyptians ever sow or eat if they come up of their own accord, either raw or boiled, the priests will not even endure to look on, since they consider it an unclean kind of pulse. Instead of a single priest, each god has the attendance of a college, at the head of which is a chief priest. When one of these dies, his son is appointed in his room. You got to remember, Amon may be the god of all. Amon is the unseen, right? But you also are familiar with Osiris and Isis. You are also familiar with Ptah. You're also familiar with Ra, because you have to understand that when before Egypt becomes a nation, and then before it becomes a state, and then before it becomes an empire, it is a collection of cities along the Nile, each one having their own god who represents a founding father, mother, spirit, the people that created this environment for them. So as they join together as the 42 provinces of ancient Kemet, no one's really giving up their gods, especially waiting for the time when one of their people or a kingdom, Thebes or the ruling family comes from their area, they get to basically elevate that god to its a preeminent place. Always, though, especially after the 11th dynasty with Amon, the unseen, the god of Africa, or god of the world at the time, god of Africa, behind them. They go on further. There's reason. This is the reason. I'm sorry. The male kine or cow, therefore, if clean, and the male calves are used to sacrifice by the Egyptians universally, but the females they are not allowed to sacrifice, since they are sacred to Isis and Hathor. Again, the horns. The statue of this goddess has the form of a woman, but with horns like a cow, resembling thus the Greek representations of Io. And Io, we'll get into that, how she represents Athens. And Egyptians, one and all, venerate cows much more highly than any other animal. This is the reason why no native of Egypt, whether man or woman, will give a Greek a kiss, or use the knife of a Greek, or his spit, or his cauldron, or taste the flesh of an ox, known to be pure, if it has been cut with a Greek knife. That's how distinct Egyptian culture was from Greek culture. This is one of the reasons why we know for a fact that ancient Egypt did not come from Greece. The cultures were just widely, way too distinct. Herodotus goes on. The Egyptians, they said, were the first to discover the solar year. Right now he's talking about how the Egyptians predated the Greeks and how the Egyptian cultures then migrated basically to Greece and specifically through Athens. The Egyptians, they said, were the first to discover the solar year and to portion out its course into 12 parts, right, to make a 12-month year. Sounds simple now, but not back then. They obtained this knowledge from the stars. To my mind, they contrived their year much more cleverly than the Greeks, for these last every other year intercalculate a whole month, but the Egyptians, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days each, add every year a space of 5 days besides, whereby the circuit of the seasons is made to return with uniformity. So by adding that 5 days, they come up with 365 days of the year, which is correct, right? They're off by a quarter of a year, and they have to add leap years later and whatnot, but they're so far advanced from any other people at the time, we don't even get that part. That 5 days becomes a celebration for us, right? It becomes Christmas and whatnot, or African Americans, Kwanzaa or whatnot. It's an ancient time. The Egyptians, they went on to affirm first, brought into the use the names of the 12 gods. The 12 gods represent the 12 months, right? Each new moon, which the Greeks adopted from them. This is why Herodotus is controversial, which the Greeks adopted from them, and first erected altars, images, and temples to the gods, also first engraved upon stone the figures of animals. In most of these cases, they proved to me that what they said was true. And after 2,000 years of research and 100 years or 200 years of European trickeration, because it was known, Martin Bernal shows that everyone knew this going up into the 15, 16, 1700s. But then the German scholars, the Anglo-Saxon scholars tried to bury it, and now we're bringing it back to light. right? But this stuff was known. It was very clear that Egyptians and Ethiopians were the first, and Africans were the first people on Earth, the first with civilization. Um, so let's contrast that. So that was a pretty good description of what it was like to be an Egyptian, to be in Kemet, right? Cleanliness, meat, very active priesthood. We could go on with our former episodes, going back to episode 1, with a very, 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 very intense and sophisticated legal and bureaucratic administration and governance. So let's contrast that with the Persians, or at least Herodotus' description of the Persians. And if you don't believe Herodotus and why they're so distinct, the question then becomes, well, why? Why would he lie? On the other hand, in between the Egyptian Nile and the Persian Euphrates and Tigris rivers lay several famous ancient nations, Arabia, Assyria, Palestine, and Phoenicia. Those are basically where we're the Middle East, right? Where we're talking about now today, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Arabia, Syria, all the way up to Turkey. And that stretches all the way to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where today we know Iraq and Iran. And so when we talk about Persians, we're talking basically about more or less the country of Iran at this period. The Persians were military powerful, but their region was fairly impoverished because of the lack of water, right? We know that the Middle East today is very dry. It's more or less deserted, right? And so they become powerful through warfare, not through wealth. Egypt becomes powerful through wealth and then warfare, where for the Persians it's the opposite. This is a speech between Croesus and the Persian king at this time. Thou art about, O king. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a speech by Croesus on whether he's going to fight the Persians. Before he joins with the Persians to attack Egypt, he had to determine whether he was going to fight them himself. Thou art about, O king, to make war against men who wear leathern trousers and have all their other garments of leather, who feed not on what they like, but on what they can get from a soil that is sterile and unkindly, who do not indulge in wine, but drink water, who possess no figs, nor anything else that is good to eat. If then thou conquerest them, what canst thou get from them, seeing that they have nothing at all? Like, what's the point of warring against these folks if they don't have anything to basically take? And that's basically the conversation you're having between the Greeks, the Lydians. The Lydians are basically the Trojans, and the Persians. Herodotus describes Egyptian warriors as being sturdier than the Persians. If then you strike the Persian skulls even with a pebble, they are so weak that you break a hole in them. But the Egyptian skulls are so strong that you may smite them with a stone, and you will scarcely break them in. Don't know if that's correct, but at least Herodotus says they gave me the following reason for this difference. So again, even when Herodotus relays something that seems somewhat incredible, he's very clear to say that he hasn't even seen this himself, that I'm just relaying a story that someone told me. They gave me the following reason for this difference, which seemed to me likely enough. He said the Egyptians from early childhood had their heads shaved, and so by the action of the sun, the skull becomes harder. I don't know if that's true. He describes Herodotus as barbarians, but he does concede that the Persians were schooled in law and had some order in society, but by the Athenians and the Colchians, who were either descendants of the originally dark-skinned Egyptians. So that's his describing the Egyptians as discrete from the Persians, which is pretty clear contrast. It's even that much further distinguished from the Scythians. The Persians are still an Asiatic people. The Persians are still people that are taking over from, again, Afrocentric hegemony. So we're talking about brown, even if not dark-skinned people, still swarthy or brown-skinned people. If you get the book When Egypt Ruled the East by Keith Seal, you'll find a picture in that book. And this is from the University of Chicago. This is not me. This is the University of Chicago Oriental Institute. and a picture of the Scythians in the year 3000 paints them as extremely, extremely dark people. So the Persians we can distinguish from the Africans, but we still would believe that they are a light brown skinned people or brown skinned people. The Scythians are what we would call, or what I guess white folks would call, the original Caucasians, right, from around the Caucasus Mountain region in basically Asia. So as much as we talk about, we assume white folks come from Europe, right? If we include Russia in the cipher, right, we see that Europe, Asia, just basically the northern portion is where we get the lighter folks that were caught by the ice ages, where the melanin depleted, where they had to war and fight against their environment, and then learn to basically rely on technology to subdue that environment instead of living along with it. So the Scythians are those that represent that patriarchal warrior culture. And Herodotus' description of them may be, he is impressed with their strength and some of their abilities, but not because of their piety or sense of justice or civilization. And so once again, there's absolutely no way that Egyptian society emanated from the Persians, the Greeks, or the Scythians, if Herodotus is anywhere even close to being to the truth. Of the Scythians, Herodotus says, the country has no marvels except its rivers, which are larger and more numerous than those of any other land. They sacrifice all sorts of cattle, but most commonly horses. And this mastery of horses and turning the horse into a weapon of war is a major feature of how the northern or European or Caucasian or whatever, how you want to describe it, how that northern world throws off the African yoke and becomes powerful in and of itself through the chariot, through the horse, through the catapult, right? This idea of mastering the technology around them. He portrays them as violent, very violent people who routinely practice human sacrifice. When prisoners are taken in war, out of every 100 men, they sacrifice one. Not, however, with the same rites as the cattle, but with different. Libations of wine are first poured upon their heads, after which they are slaughtered over a vessel. The vessel is then carried up to the top of the pile, and the blood poured upon the scimitar. Then the other victims are slain, and those who have offered the sacrifice depart, leaving their hands and arms where they may chance to have fallen, the bodies also separate. The Egyptians practice, again, venerate the goddess Ma'at, right, with the wings, order, truth, justice, balance. It's a means of reducing confrontation and violence in a society that had come to live together for over 3,000 years. But in Scythia, we have, again, this very, very rugged, let's just call it, culture where killing is a prerequisite to full citizenship. If you're not a killer, you can't even be down. Once a year, the governor of each district, at a set place in his own province, mingles a bowl of wine of which all Scythians have a right to drink, by whom foes have been slain, by how many foes have been slain, while they who have slain no enemy are not allowed to taste of the bowl, but sit aloof in disgrace. No greater shame than this can happen to them. Such as have slain a very large number of foes, have 2 cups instead of 1, and drink from both, deuce-fisted. Because I'm a murderer, because I'm a killer, right? Whereas if you have not killed people, you're not even down with the society. That's intense. Scalping and collecting scalps were the Scythian things to do. The skulls of their enemies, not indeed of all, but of those whom they most detest, they treat as follows. Having sawn off the portion below the eyebrows and cleaned out the inside, they cover the outside with leather. When a man is poor, this is all that he does, but if he is rich, he is also lined the inside with gold. In either case, the skull is used as a drinking cup. That's what I'm going to do with the head of my enemies. They do the same with the skulls of their own kin if they have been at feud with them. and have vanquished them in the presence of the king. When strangers whom they deem of any account come to visit them, these skulls are handed around, and the host tells them how that these were his relations who made war upon him, and how that he had got the better of them, and all this being looked upon as proof of bravery. Okay, right? In contrast with Mott and the teachings of Tahotep, with the tale of the eloquent peasant, the Egyptian legal system is generally, Scythian legal system is pretty much arbitrary. It doesn't follow a very true process of law, right? There's no due process of law. Whenever the Scythian king falls sick, he sends for 3 soothsayers of most renown at the time, who come and make trial of their art in the mode above described. Generally, they say that the king is ill because such a person, mentioning his name, has sworn falsely by the royal hearth. Isn't this how they describe Africans, right? This is how they describe African tribalism, right? That if the king is sick, a witch doctor comes along and says it's because of some person who's cast a spell. Well, this is what we're talking about. This is Scythian culture, right? This is Ukrainian, Russian culture of 3,000, 2,000 years ago. Then the man accused of having forsworn himself is arrested and brought before the king. The soothsayers tell him that by their art it is clear he's sworn a false oath by the royal hearth, and so caused the illness of the king. He denies the charge, protests that he has sworn no false oath, and loudly complains of the wrong done to him. Upon this, the king sends for 6 new soothsayers who try the matter by soothsaying. If they too find the man guilty of the offense, straightway he is beheaded. Wow, that's a trial? Right? No facts, evidence, just they said you're evil. Not only is he beheaded by those who first accused him, and his goods are parted among them. They get to take a step. Right? So you can imagine that they're going to go after the wealthier kind. So maybe that's why they don't have very many marbles. If, on the contrary, they acquit him, other soothsayers, and again others are sent for to try the case, should the greater number decide in favor of the man's innocence, then they who first accused him forfeit their lives, and I assume their property. So you better choose wisely. You better politic this correctly. Again, due process, equal protection of law, these things, the rule of law, these things are very lightly practiced, if at all. Sons pay for the crimes of their fathers. When the king puts one of them to death, he takes care not to let any of his sons survive. All the male offspring are slain with the father, only the females being allowed to live. That's how you're treating your old people. Again, the concept of Mott, due process, equal protection, just absolutely absent here. In the open space around the body of this king, they bury one of his concubines, first killing her by strangling, and also his cupbearer, his cook, his groom, his lackey, his messenger, some of his horses, firstlings of all his other possessions, and some golden cups, for they use neither silver nor brass. So when the king dies, man, however close you were, now here's the thing. It's a hard scrabble existence for most people. So the fact that you lived near and close proximity to the king as one of these people, you probably lived a very, very, very privileged life. So this is the downside. On the one hand, you get all the good stuff. On the other hand, when the king goes, you go with him. The first anniversary of a king's death was also celebrated. When a year is gone by, further ceremonies take place. 50 of the best of the late king's attendants are taken and killed. Whew. It also becomes a tax holiday. I guess that's the good part. When a Persian king dies or a Scythian king dies, nobody has to pay any more taxes. But I maintain that that's because it's a celebration. Like, oh my God, the yoke is off our neck. Our oppressor is dead. So we don't have to pay taxes. That's different from Egypt. They don't, though the practice in Egypt, like, apparently, is that the taxes continue. And it has to. Because what is very important here is the Eurasian world relies on a system of African feudal taxation, which taxes every single province, brings those goods to the central government, and then redistributes those goods to all the different provinces. So that way, you make tin, you bring bronze, you bring gold, you bring chairs, you bring vases, you bring cereal, you bring wine, you bring meat. It all comes to the central government, and then it's redistributed to all the other provinces, so that each province has something of the whole empire. So that's how the empire's tied together. That's why it stays together for 2,000-3,000 years, because the plenty is assured for everyone with respect to that. Now, maybe not everyone, but at least to have the ostrich eggs in Kenya enjoyed in Greece, and the silver vases in Greece holding things in Nubia depends on Egypt being the central distribution point. But Scythians, again, I like that. When their kings died, oh, I ain't got to pay my taxes. Great, let me keep my stuff because I don't get a lot from giving it to the king. Now, here's to me where we spoke about Egyptians and cleanliness. We talked about circumcision. We talked about the priests taking 2 baths a day, 2 baths at night, the linen, the cups being cleaned and whatnot. Let's now take a look at Scythian life. And the interesting thing about Scythian life is it's not in 500 BC. It is not that much unlike, let's say, English or German culture in 1500 AD, right before the Moors come and teach them all about science and what have you. The Scythians, as I said, take some of this hemp seed. Yes, I said hemp seed. It was getting high. They were smoking weed. The Scythians, as I said, take some of this hemp seed and creeping under the felt coverings, throw it upon the red-hot stones. Immediately it smokes and gives out such a vapor as no Grecian vapor bath can exceed. So everybody's going to get soup. The Scyths delighted and shout for joy, and the vapor serves them instead of a water bath, for they never by any chance wash their bodies with water. Let me say that again. It's not my words. This is specifically from Herodotus as interpreted by some 19th century dude in the United States or England. The Scyths delighted, shout for joy, and the vapor from the hemp seed serves them instead of a water bath, for they never by any chance wash their bodies with water. Okay, we're going to move on from there. But again, this is the main point that we're making, is that there are a very distinct cultural difference between Africans through these Egyptians and the Scythians, the Greeks, and the Persians. We're also going to see through our descriptions of Herodotus' descriptions of Ethiopians and Nubians that Ethiopian and Nubian culture is so much close, it's very, very close to Egyptian culture, whereas Greek, Persian, and Scythian culture is not. So the very simple fact that an African country rested upon an African foundation and created an African culture, and they had the power to spread this culture to other parts of the world, or at least their world, into the Middle East or Arabia and Greece, should not be remarkable, but unfortunately it still is. Even the Scythians and the Greeks didn't get along, so it couldn't have come. The Scythians have an extreme hatred of all foreign customs, particularly those in use among the Greeks. And again, remember that the Greeks are considered the former colonies of the Egyptians. So before we end this and move on to the second chapter a little later, again, let me just state that Herodotus is called the father of history when folks like him, but he is called the father of lies when you bring up these matters. So prepare for that, right? Know that if you cite Herodotus to talk about the oracles, or the oldest of all men, or the grandeur of Egypt or Kemet, golden fetters, the fountain of youth we're going to talk about later, the table of the sun, all these great things, they're going to turn around and say, oh yeah, well, Strabo called him the father of lies. Well, again, first of all, nothing we've said here should be out of the extraordinary. Secondly, we should wonder if he was lying, where did he get it from? And if he did get it from somewhere, why would we believe that it's so far from the truth that we can't even grab kernels? Because all we need is kernels of this stuff to show very sharp distinctions. But let's make the point that Herodotus is critical of things that are favorable to Egypt. So the idea that he is just this person who wants to praise Egypt at the expense of Greeks and all that is just plain false. He doubts that the Egyptians are, as they claim, the oldest of all men. He says, now the Egyptians before the reign of their king Psammetichus believed themselves to be the most ancient of mankind, and since Psammetichus, however, made an attempt to discover who were actually the primitive race, they have been of the opinion that while they surpass all other nations, the Phrygians surpass them in their antiquity. It goes on to finally say, what they told me concerning the original. But he again doubts that. For my own part, I do not believe that these orders were ever given by a mass of the Egyptians, as it seems to me false to assert, to save their own dignity. So again, these are two matters on being the oldest, on whether they tricked the Persians with the corpse of Amasis. Here's the third one. The Egyptians claimed they had been conquered by the Persians. But what they try to do is, because Egypt is a matriarchal society, they tried to claim that Cambyses was the son of a black woman. And that way he could be legitimately praised as a legitimate pharaoh. That was the idea. Now, it didn't work very well, but they tried. And so the Egyptians that basically supported the Persians said, the Egyptians, however, claimed Cambyses as belonging to them, declaring that he was the son of Nititis. It was Cyrus, they say, and not Cambyses who sent to Amasis for his daughter, but here they misstate the truth. Acquainted as they are beyond all other men with the laws and customs of the Persians, they cannot be well aware, first, that it is not the Persian want to allow a bastard to reign when there is a legitimate heir. In other words, patriarchy. They know that even though they may be matriarchal, the Persians are patriarchal. And next, that Cambyses was the son of Cassandin, the daughter of Phronaspes and Achaemenian, and not of this Egyptian. But the fact is that they pervert history in order to claim relation with the house of Cyrus. Such is the truth of this matter. So it is Herodotus being critical of Egyptians in the scene, saying that that they were trying to pervert history by claiming a unfounded relationship with the Persians. So let's think about that. Herodotus is very clear to say you are not that good, but yet my other statements, I'm going to give you your due on everything else. I'm just not going to believe some of the more extraordinary things about the Egyptian people. So this lends a lot more credibility to Herodotus' description of the oracles as black, about the piety and the piousness of Egyptians, Ethiopians, Africans, Ammonians, and whatnot. So we're going to stop here because I think we've set up why Herodotus is so important, right? These are some of the quotes that a lot of people will use to describe Egypt as black. But in the next 4 to 5 episodes, we know that. So let's take it further. Let's know that Egypt and Ethiopia were black countries at that time, and use the rest of Herodotus' histories, especially that which relates to tax, and talk about the extent of those empires, and talk about the grandeur of those empires, but also, it's not all good, we're also going to be talking about the decline of those empires, and how they were eventually ransacked and run over by the Lydians, the Greeks, and the Persians, and how they tried to resist and hold on, but in the end, Egyptian culture then had to pass through the south. You note that the Persians and all those other folks, they took the greatness of Egypt, but they didn't try to build pyramids, and they didn't try to do mummification in Europe, in Asia. Those practices continued in Africa, right? The language, the customs, all of those things passed through Lake Chad, all the way to the Niger River, then down south to the Congo River, down to the Zambezi, to the point where we see a political and cultural African unity throughout the continent, from 3000 BC all the way up to the present. And then, as we load up ships and the African diaspora sends black folks to the Americas, we see in America the same commitment to greater commitment to equal protection of law, at least by African Americans and the law professors who we believe try to represent them. So we're going to stop here. Hope to see you very shortly with episode 17, where we talk about, again, Akhmos, the pharaoh Akhmos, versus the Greek king Polycrates, and what seems to be the very first conflict between Europe and Africa. So Till then, Hotep, and we'll see you later. Professor Smith signing out. Holla one time.